I'm a massive fan of the Nepalese GURKHA kukri, which has been featured a lot on the channel over these years in its various different forms, talking about its evolution and origin and use, and I've reviewed quite a few as well. But what I want to cover briefly in this video is the fact that these don't have the origin which lots of places on the internet attribute to them. I'll explain more about that in a second. And also a fantastic new option which is available to buy right now. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So this isn't a sponsored video, but as you know, I acquire various kukris from different makers and have reviewed them over these years, and this isn't really a full review so much, but really to point out there is a new maker on the block, not new, but maybe new to you, and that's Himalayan Blades, and they made this Royal GURKHA kukri, which is absolutely gorgeous, and we are really blessed. In fact, I'll leave the scabbard aside for a second. We are really blessed that compared to 10 or 20 years ago, there really were only one or two, well, I would say two or three maybe, really good kukri makers in Nepal making good replica kukris, which were on a par with the antiques. This is an antique 19th century example. And what do I mean by that? Well, quite simply, they were a little bit chunky, a little bit overweight. They didn't have great edge geometry. They didn't have the right taper in the blade and this kind of stuff. And really over time, some of the makers in Nepal have got closer and closer to the originals, such that, to be honest, some of them being made now by companies like Himalayan Blades are as good as the originals. So this is based on an example that would have been available in around the year 1900 or up until the First World War. So it's a type of kukri which was used extensively in the First World War, and I tell you, it is wonderfully light. It has a hollow ground blade. I've done a little bit of cutting with it so far and it's very sharp, but it also seems to have really good edge retention and things like that. Beautiful black horn grip, and it comes with a completely traditional World War I era, possibly between the wars as well, era scabbard. With its two buy knives. It's got one knife, and then this one's for actually honing the edge, so that doesn't have an edge on it, and the chakmak and the card, and so a beautiful set. But the main reason I'm throwing together this quick video for you is a little extra for the Easter weekend, because I don't normally do videos at this time of the week, but I thought I'd do an extra one for you because I was playing with this kukri and thought it'd be a good time to do it. Is the origin of the kukri. So when we're looking at whether it's antiques or very good replicas like this one by Himalayan Blades, when we're looking at these and when you look online, and I have to say, I don't want to point any fingers, including some of the Nepalese kukri makers' own websites, there is a sad piece of misinformation that says that these have their origin in the Greek or Macedonian Machaira or kopis. In other words, the swords brought through Afghanistan essentially by the Macedonians under Alexander the Great. And this is a great bit of marketing, but there is absolutely no historical evidence to support this. There is a big gap of time between the Macedonians and centuries later the appearance of the kukri. But what I can tell you is where the kukri does come from. Now, anybody who's studied their geography well knows that Nepal is just above India. So many things in Nepal are influenced by India, whether it's religion or types of clothing and language, or indeed the weapons. And in fact, if we go to Nepal, many people in Nepal were using for swords the talwar, which is a sword which we generally associate with India, but you could also find it in Nepal, Afghanistan and surrounding areas, and in fact even in Persia as well. But here's the thing, and I have encountered quite a few Indian people who deny this, but the simple fact is they just get some good books, we're going to look at one in a second, then they can find this information. The talwar of this form with a saber type blade or shamshir type blade essentially doesn't appear in India really until the 15th, 16th century with the arrival of Persian culture, so essentially the Mughals. Okay, so as we start to get the Islamic movement moving into India with the Mughals and with Persian influence, that's when we start to get curved swords that curve backwards like a saber or a shamshir like this. So fundamentally, although there may have been a few isolated examples before that, fundamentally this type of blade really starts to predominate in India from the 15th and 16th century onwards. So the question therefore goes, what were Indians and surrounding areas using before that? Well, in fact, the hilt actually, as you see here with the famous disc pommel, is something that we find in the subcontinent going back before that period, but usually with other types of blade. Now, I'm very lucky to have a lot of good books on Indian weapons, but this is one of the most recent publications called Arms and Armour of India, Nepal and Sri Lanka by Ravinder Reddy, and this was published just a few years ago, a handful of years ago now, and I got it when it was new out. Now, this, like any works really on arms and armour, relies on research partially from surviving examples from armories, of which there's several in India, several famous ones, but also from artworks. And when we look at paintings, we can see over time, because the paintings are dated, I'll just put an example up there, there's a Sikh Nihang there. We can look at the paintings, you can see he's got two katars shoved into his sash. We can see the dating of the manuscripts or the paintings, and obviously that helps us learn about the exact periods of the arms and armour which we study. So, you know, a typical weapon like this, there's no way of dating it unless we cross-reference it with artistic sources. It's not always paintings or manuscripts, sometimes it's sculptures and friezes on walls and things like this, and sometimes even descriptive text. But there's a certain type of sword which predates the saber-like talwar in India and was incredibly prevalent. And here we have a blade for it. Now, if I hold it that way round, it's actually got the hilt missing. You look at the shape of that blade and now start to look at kukris. Now, they're not identical by any means. However, if we look at this example here, from the Kolarama temple, it's early 11th century. So in the 11th century, they weren't using the saber-shaped talwar that we're used to. Look at the shape of that blade. Hopefully you can see that clearly. It's going up there. Now, this type of sword does actually survive into later centuries. However, it was usually preserved as in forms of kind of ritualistic and temple swords, and in fact we find some temple swords with this type of blade. But in common usage as a battlefield weapon, as a sidearm, as a sword, this type of sword really starts to disappear with the introduction of the more popular and later designed typical it's curved blade, shamshir blade almost, kind of talwar that we see here. And of course there were other forms of sword. There were straight forms of sword, double-edged and single-edged, like the pata, the patissa, also the kanda, various other types of sword. But this type of sword and the associated knives like the khanjar, so the sword-sized ones, are the relatives of the kukri. So in fact, we don't need to look to classical Greece or the Macedonians for the origin of the kukri. The kukri has its origins in the Indian subcontinent. It didn't really come from somewhere else. It seems to have developed there. It wasn't like a foreign invention, which ironically we could say the talwar is, but instead this forwards curving blade was a type of blade which had been around for centuries in India, Nepal and surrounding areas. So there we go. In terms of this particular example, incidentally, Himalayan blades, highly recommended. It's as good as any of the other good quality kukri makers which I've personally got hands on. Everything is really well finished, good fit and finish, very nice shaping on the grip, you'll notice there, which really gives good hand retention. But the most important thing, you could say, is the blade. And this blade is really light. It is lighter than it looks, and actually it's lighter than my antique, I have to say, because this particular example has a kind of hollow ground, concave faces on both sides of the blade. So it's got a really, really good weight to it, and while you've still got a good amount of heft, I'll just move a bit further away from the camera, while it's got a good amount of heft to it and it feels like a kukri, it's really quick and responsive for this particular form of blade. Incidentally, this one goes all the way through and is peened at the end there. which is not how most kukris were traditionally made until European contact, so there is European involvement, but it does seem that in the 19th century there was a gradual movement to bring the tangs all the way through to the end and peened, and then later on in World War I we start to get the introduction of riveted through full slab construction when they were used by the British Empire military in the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, but particularly in World War I. But this is slightly more traditional because it's got a hidden tang, but then it is peened at the end. The earlier ones are simply glued into the tang and don't go all the way to the end. So there we go. A little bit of history about the kukri. Hopefully try and spread that information. I'd really want people to start getting it out of their head that this has any relationship to the Greek makara or the kopis. It doesn't. This is an indigenous Indian subcontinent weapon which the Nepalese came out with this particular form, and we find these going all the way back into the kind of 15th, 16th century, actually a similar time to the Talwar. But the predecessors of this were types of Indian subcontinent sword, which go all the way back, as I showed you that example, on a temple dating to the 11th century. And it goes back probably to about the 6th century, according to the archaeology that we have at the moment. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I'll stick a link below down to Himalayan blades. Check them out. They've got lots of awesome offerings. And I have been Matt Easton, I'll continue to be, and I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks.